Hey guys, this is the last video in the taxonomy video series. In this video we're going to talk about plants and a couple of unique features of plants that don't really fit into any other videos. So remember, we are in the domain of eukaryotes, or the eukarya, and in that domain we have protists, fungi, animals, and plants. So we're going to use the same kind of flowchart idea that we used for the animals, where we ask a question and the answer to that question guides us through the taxonomy of plants. So the first question is, are you vascularized? Do you have vascular tissue? So if you've heard the terms phloem and xylem, those are vascular tissues in a plant. So phloem, and we'll talk more about this in a plant anatomy video, phloem carry water and nutrients up the plant, xylem carry it down the plant stem. But if you don't have vascular tissue, then you're a bryophyte. Bryophytes are commonly asked about on the DAT. They are mosses and lichens. So just think mosses grow in moist locations, lots of times like on trees and swamps. They do not have stems. They just grow, they're kind of like a really flat grass, and they don't have stems because they don't have vascular tissue, so they have no way to transport water other than just absorbing it. They can't move it up a stem. So that's a way to remember that bryophytes are, or that mosses are non-vascularized. So if you do have vascular tissue, the next question we need to ask is, do you produce seeds? If you do not produce seeds, then you're a tracheophyte. If you do produce seeds, then we'll move on to the left side of the flowchart. So if you do not produce seeds, you are a tracheophyte. And the main tracheophyte you need to know for the DAT is the fern, which we've talked a lot about because we've talked a lot about them in previous videos, because ferns reproduce by spores as their life cycle follows an alternation of generations, which we've already talked about. So you can go watch the alternation of generations video if you have questions on that. The spores of ferns are bisexual, or the other word for that you should know is homosporous, as compared to plants that produce spores that are male or female, or micro or megaspores. So male spores are microspores, female spores are megaspores, and that's also been discussed in a previous video. But the spores of ferns are bisexual, so they're homosporous. So because ferns are vascularized, they are tracheophytes. Trachea, you can just think of, you have a trachea that helps move air up and down in your body, and ferns have tubes that run up and down their leaves. So they're tracheophytes. They are vascularized, but they do not produce seeds. If you do produce seeds, the next question we need to ask is, do you produce flowers? So if you do not produce flowers, you're a gymnosperm. If you do, you're an angiosperm. So you're probably already familiar with those two terms just because these are pretty common. So the most common gymnosperm you'll need to know are just like coniferous trees. So I've drawn a pine tree over here. And angiosperms are basically everything else that is not a conifer, a fern, or a moss. Basically everything else is an angiosperm. So, like we said, they produce seeds, they produce flowers. There are a couple of unique things about angiosperms that are good to talk about at this point as well. We'll first go on to the division within angiosperms. If the angiosperm has narrow leaves, it's a monocot. If it has broad leaves, it's a dicot. So you've probably heard these terms before. They can be kind of confusing, but there's a couple different things you need to know about each of them. And once you understand those things, the terms aren't that confusing anymore. So when you think of a monocot, you should just think of grass, like the grass that grows in your yard. That's the most common example of a monocot. It's very narrow, and we'll talk about some other characteristics of them later. Whereas dicots are things like trees. So some of the features of monocots and dicots you should know. Well, one difference between the two is their sepal number. So a sepal or a sepal is what covers the bud of a flower. So before these petals were petals, they were folded up covering the budding flower. So monocots have sepals in multiples of 3, whereas dicots have sepals in multiples of 4 or 5. So if we look at this flower here, how many sepals do we have, or how many petals? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it has a multiple of 3, so that flower, that plant that that flower came from would be a monocot. So you won't be asked to count petals probably on the DAT, but they could ask you questions that deal with that. Another important distinction between monocots and dicots has to do with the arrangement of their vascular tissue, or their veins, as they're sometimes called. So if you look at a tree leaf, you're going to see little veins running through it that have a net-like structure. They all branch off of each other. And that's characteristic of dicots, whereas monocots, I'm not going to draw it, but their vascular tissue runs parallel to each other. So if you look at a blade of grass, you're not going to see this net-like structure. You'd see parallel lines on a blade of grass. So dicots have net-like vein structures, and monocots, veins run parallel to one another. The last distinction between monocots and dicots has to do with when they first start to grow. So when a monocot first sprouts, we'll have some roots beneath the ground, and it's going to send up a single leaf shoot. Whereas, this is where the dirt would be. Whereas in a dicot, they send up 2 leaves, and then the main shoot will grow between them. So that's another important distinction. That's actually where the name comes from, because these shoots, these original shoots here and here and here, are called cotyledons. So this is a monocot and this is a dicot. It originally shoots up 2 leaves, whereas this just shoots up 1. So those are the distinctions you need to know between monocots and dicots. The last thing we want to talk about really quick is a unique feature of angiosperm, which is double fertilization, which may come up. So I've drawn here, this would be the style of a plant, and again, this will all be covered more in depth in a plant anatomy video, but this is the style or the tube down which the sperm of the plant go. So these are both sperm. And this is the egg of a plant, this is the ovary, and these are polar bodies. They're cells that are produced when the egg divides, and these will not be used to develop a seed. But what happens in double fertilization is one of the sperm will fertilize the actual egg and become the seed that will eventually develop into a new plant, while the other sperm is going to fertilize these polar bodies. So these 2 polar bodies will actually come together, and the second sperm will fertilize the 2 polar bodies and become this 3N. It's called an endosperm. So after that fertilization happens, you'll get this 3N. 3N is its ploidy number because it brought together 3 cells that each had N chromosomes. So that becomes an endosperm, which serves to provide nutrients to the actual 2N seed. So just to recap again, one of the sperm will fertilize the actual egg and develop into a seed that will become a plant, while the other sperm fertilizes the polar bodies, forming a 3N endosperm that provides nutrients to the developing seed. Anyway, hope that helped you understand the plant taxonomy better.